A revolution is expensive. You need to buy supplies, equipment, and pay your soldiers. For the founding fathers in the early days of the American Revolution, it looked like an insurmountable task. That's why they turned to Robert Morris. I learned about Robert Morris, the financier of the American Revolution. I've already done an episode on the man called the financier of the Civil War, Jay Cook. So I thought to myself, why not do one on the man called the financier of the American Revolution, Robert Morris? And well, here we are. You probably gathered that from the title, but still, here we are. Robert Morris was a man called the financier of the Revolution because he played a pretty big role in the funding of the colonial side of things, the American side. The American Revolution wasn't cheap. Congress reported after the war that it totaled nearly $8 million in foreign loans and $42 million in domestic loans. That's just loans. It's a lot of money, especially for that time. I mean, it's a lot of money now, even though when we talk about the American budget, we're talking trillions and whatnot. But still, I don't have that money. If you do you want to give it to me? Maybe. So that's a lot, and Congress needed help getting the funds. They were in a tight spot even after their leader of the army, George Washington, did them a favor by declaring he wouldn't accept a salary. He only requested his expenses be reimbursed. Honestly, that fact isn't overly relevant to this topic, but it's something that I just find fascinating every time I hear it. Just what a move by the future president. Also, I won't lie, I picture Washington having to deal with someone from accounting as he justifies his expense report. That dinner at camp shouldn't have cost that much money. That's where my mind goes. Washington himself is relevant to the story because he shows up numerous times in Robert Morris's story. He's always essentially begging for money and supplies. He needs money to pay his soldiers, he needs money for the supplies, food, blankets, ammo, guns, basically all the stuff you need to fight a war. Almost immediately, Congress realized they were in trouble regarding the funding of the war effort. First, they couldn't tax. Aside from not having the authority to issue a federal tax, the political ramifications of taxing the citizens would have been disastrous. How do you say we're fighting because of high taxes and then immediately come around and tax? I know people probably realize at some point some money is going to have to come from somewhere, but they couldn't really turn around and do it right away. So that was their first problem. You may be asking, what did Congress do, at least initially, to help out? Well, the inability to levy taxes left Congress with several options: issuing their own currency, foreign and domestic loans, and borrowing on the credit of one of its wealthiest members, who just so happened to be Robert Morris. Now, truthfully, taxation in a form makes its way into the plan, but we'll get there, just not yet. Creating and distributing its own form of currency was a favorite method of Congress. In 1775, Congress began to issue the Continental dollar, which they used to pay for their purchases. I wonder where they thought of the name. Historian Farley Grubb concluded that from 1775 through 1779, net new emissions totaled almost $200 million face value and accounted for 77% of congressional spending. It's a staggering figure. It's a lot of money that they printed on their own. But it does have some problems, and here's a couple of the ones that the Continental dollar ran into. The first is that the Continental dollar was devalued because of counterfeiting. Listen, there's always going to be someone trying to get around the law. There's always going to be your criminals who counterfeit just because it's great for personal gain. But really, that wasn't the problem. The British was the problem. The British kept counterfeiting the Continental dollar, and they had the money and the means to do a fairly effective job of it. Now, just in case anyone's curious, why is counterfeiting a bad thing? Think of it this way. If you issue 100 Continental dollars backed by 100 pieces of gold, the value of $1 is one piece of gold. However, if all of a sudden $100 worth of these high quality counterfeits hit the market, well, now you have $200, but only 100 pieces of gold. So now your notes are only worth 50% of their intended value. That exchange rate isn't what they were back then. I'm just giving you what it was. An example, I should say. You can see the problem here, especially when counterfeits were quite good. But also, let's be fair. Congress devalued its own dollar by issuing far more than it could support based on its original redemption requirements. Grubb sums it up perfectly. In other words, Congress had recklessly emitted excessive amounts of a fiat currency, paper Continental dollars, which caused runaway price inflation, runaway currency depreciation, that destroyed its value and led to abandonment. In my admittedly non expert opinion, I think it's worth debating if Congress ever planned on truly having to redeem their currency at its full value. I wonder if they knew they would lessen its impact by overinflating it, like it was a plan. Again, I'm learning about this topic and relaying information I learned to you, but that fact kind of stood out to me. Felt like it might be a plan. Another issue for the Continental dollar was that it was competing with state issue currencies. More precisely, competing for the same assets to back those currencies. States want to issue $100 of notes too, but there's only so much gold to go around, so there was competition. That hurt the Continental dollar. Along with Continental dollars, Congress turned to loans. Now, I think for many people, France has long been considered the primary lender for the American Revolution, but they didn't really offer loans until later in the war. Also, as I pointed out earlier, foreign loans were far below levels of domestic loans. So you might ask, how did Continental Congress get these domestic loans? What was the procedure here? They didn't have a bank to walk into where they could meet the manager or the loan officer, so what did they do? Well, the Continental Congress formed Continental loan offices in 13 states. Historian Charles Rapelye explains that they began in 1776 by offering 5 million certificates paying 4% interest. However, they weren't getting a lot of response because there was competition from state treasuries, who were also issuing notes of interest, so they ended up at 6%. That allowed them to be a little bit more competitive. Quick side note, I don't think I ever fully appreciated the level at which states and Congress competed during this time. They didn't appear to be on the same page at all, which is fascinating. I mean, I had read about issues between states and Congress, but I don't think I ever knew they worked against each other financially. It's kind of new information for me. Relaying it to you. But anyway, back to the loans. For anyone who's ever gotten a loan, there's one big downside to it: the interest payments. By war's end, Congress estimated that the yearly interest payments on these loans was nearly $2.5 million. Again, that's a lot of money at that time, even now. The large sum makes it so that not only were loans difficult to obtain, they were very costly for the Continental Congress. Repaying just the interest of $2.5 million was not easy for a very poor Congress. But just because these loans had limitations didn't mean that Congress stopped trying to get them. Naturally, they reached out to France. Of the $8 million from foreign loans, Congress owed $7 million of it to France. That figure does not include France's $2 million gift to Congress. These are numbers that I've gathered from different sources. My sources will be in the description if anyone is curious. Those numbers tell us that France held the majority of foreign loans. Now, the advantage of borrowing from France was pretty nice because first, Congress didn't have to repay the loans until 1786. And truthfully, France seemed relatively unconcerned about repayment, considering the original repayment date of 1786 passed with Congress not sending a dime and France launching no complaint. Don't we wish all loans played out that way? The real issue with borrowing from France was France's willingness. France had little interest in sending funds to the Continental Congress early in the conflict. Now, I get it. You're France, and you're looking at the conflict. You're thinking, the colonies have a chance to win? Like, are we just throwing away our money if we give it to them now? They're going to get smoked by the British. That changed after the Battle of Saratoga, per historian Ben Baack. With the defeat of the British at Saratoga, Congress saw an opportunity to convince the French that the Americans had a reasonable chance of success in the war. Within a month, it approved the Articles of Confederation with the hope that this action, coupled with the victory of Saratoga, would persuade the French to recognize and assist American independence. Clearly, the colonial leaders saw that win as a big deal. But even with the changes in attitude in France, seeing, hey, America is actually able to put up a fight, they were still slow with the money. But I need to be fair to France. Their biggest support will be their military contribution. I don't want anyone to overlook France's financial aid. I mean, again, $7 million is a lot of money. But when you're really looking at what France did for America, it's the supply of men, troops, and ships, which, by the way, let's be even more if you're here, troops and ships cost money. That's what America couldn't fund on its own. And France is giving it as part of their help. So there's a financial component to that. It's just when you're looking at purely borrowings and whatnot, the number is lesser. But I don't want to downplay France's help. So, struggling with options in 1777, Congress decided it was time to finally initiate a federal tax. Initially, the tax was voluntary. Congress listed what each state needed to contribute, but it was up to the state to decide if they wanted to pay the amount. Congress would publish a state contribution letter in effort to shame those not paying. Peer pressure, working since 1777. But Congress decided they needed to do more, so they started to seize the property of loyalists. States would then sell the property and have the proceeds sent to Congress. Selling other people's stuff is always an easy way to make money. But Congress still felt they needed more from the states. So in March of 1781, Congress passed the Articles of Confederation, which allowed for tariffs on imported goods. Tariffs would be the closest mandatory tax Congress ratified. I covered tariffs in my Smoot Hawley episode, but essentially tariffs are a tax on goods coming over. A company imports a good from somewhere else, they pay the government a fee for doing so. That's the simplest way I'm going to put it for right now. But even with all this, Congress still experienced shortfalls. Plus, issuing currency, loans, taxes takes time, and the Army needed funding immediately. Soldiers were in the field. So, how could Congress obtain goods for the Army while they waited? What other options did they have? Enter our star, Robert Morris. Morris was obviously a known figure in America. His name was on the Declaration of Independence. I think that's a pretty big indicator of how he was viewed and what his role was. He was important enough to be on the Declaration of Independence. He was 42 when he signed it. Making me feel bad about myself and what I've done, Mr. Morris. Morris had grown his wealth through an exceptionally profitable shipping firm. He was the unofficial head of finance from the start. You can tell because he was placed on all committees relating to finance and purchasing, and he would go on to earn titles newly created by Congress for him. Early on, Morris understood that Congress didn't have the financial strength necessary to purchase goods and supplies. Who would buy from a Congress that was poor and new? So, what did Morris do and how did he help Congress? Well, he used his personal credit as a guarantee on some loans. As historian Ray Raphael puts it, merchants who refused to deal with floundering Congress were willing to do business with the financier, as he was called, both at home and abroad. They would not accept Continental currency, but they would take Morris notes, which were treasury bills backed by his personal credit. If the government could not pay, Morris himself promised he would. Morris put his personal wealth on line to guarantee payments and shipments. That's pretty impressive. You're essentially offering your own personal wealth as collateral on the loan. That's a lot of risk there. But I guess he just really believed in the revolution. Especially because it was far from certain that the Continental Army would win. They were facing the British Army, which was one of the best and most professional armies in the world. Can't overstate that. But Morris, as a signer of the Declaration of Independence, believed in the United States. Making things even riskier for him was the fact that he often funded the money necessary to purchase supplies. Then he would have to send a reimbursement request to Congress. Another perfect time for Kevin from accounting to come in and ask about that expense report. Morris was willing to do all this in the direst of times for the Army. George Washington wrote to Morris in December of 1776 requesting aid, saying how bad things were. So, Morris paid merchants and suppliers whatever was necessary to get the soldiers what they needed. He followed that up by giving another $50,000 in January to help Washington pay for his soldiers. He was stepping up in the direst of times. Morris would also attempt to bring other business leaders into the fold to help the war efforts. There is a letter between Philip Schuyler and George Washington from June of 1780, where Schuyler talked about Morris creating an association with the purpose of furnishing the army with rations. Now, they weren't altruistic. Even though they were going to front the cash, they expect a reimbursement and likely some profit on the deal, but that's neither here nor there. Now, you might ask, how is Morris so involved in this? How are his fingerprints everywhere? I know he's the head of finance, but still. Well, he was on what was called the Secret Committee. And the Secret Committee was composed of several congressmen whose job was to purchase war material. It was usually through a series of agents and contractors on behalf of Congress. Why did they need a secret committee? Well, one, I just think it's a cool way to say you're on a secret committee. It sounds really cool. But two, it helped facilitate quicker and easier purchases. Instead of going through everyone, you just had a small group that did it. This is where I will have to say Morris took advantage of things, his being on the secret committee. Because guess whose shipping company was often selected by Congress? Oh, yes, it's Robert Morris's. How weird. Nice way to make money, though. While he was on the committee, he looked at the American financing system and thought to himself, this could change. So he proposed to Congress the Bank of Pennsylvania. The Bank of Pennsylvania would not operate as a traditional bank like we know today. They would be a public depositor where private funds could be deposited. The bank would then provide bills to be distributed. These bills would maintain value based on the merchant's confidence in accepting them. Basically, people could put money in the bank would then issue their own bills, and merchants would accept them, believing there'd be funds in the bank to back that up. Furthermore, people put their money in the bank based on the confidence that Congress would eventually repay them. It's a crazy system. The bank opened in July 1777, and it was a huge success. At one point, Washington reported that it was the principal source of his supplies, being that he got most of the bills to go buy supplies. Morris was doing so much that in 1781, Congress voted him as the first and only superintendent of finance of the United States. In this position, Morris oversaw the Continental Congress's financial decisions. Realistically, Robert Morris was in charge of all financial decisions, loans, purchases, and whatever for the United States. While as superintendent, Morris completed his last contribution, his last great cause. He created the Bank of North America. And I hesitated because I also called him the Super Nintendo for any Simpsons fans. The Bank of North America was opened in 1782 and was the first commercially chartered bank in the United States, meaning it did not operate the same way as the Bank of Pennsylvania. This was more like a traditional bank. Well, traditional for back then. I specify back then because banking has evolved so much that comparing a bank from the 18th century to now just doesn't make sense. Things have changed. Realistically, this bank was felt more after the war, but it's still important to note. Now, as I was learning about Robert Morris, there were a couple of things I noted. First of all, his timing as the financier of the revolution was not all sunshine and rainbows. He had struggles. I mean, he fought with Congress on ways to get funding. They didn't always want to go along with his plan. He really wanted a tax. But they were hesitant because of the reasons I pointed out earlier. It would have been a bad idea for them. Tariffs did satisfy him somewhat, but he really fought with Congress over getting funds. Also, I learned about something called the Newburgh Conspiracy. Now, I had never heard of this, to be quite honest with you. It was a potential mutiny that happened in the March of 1783, wherein a group of Continental soldiers weren't getting paid. They were poor, they wanted money. They started putting pressure on Congress to get money. There were inflammatory letters and words being whispered in the soldiers' ears. There was talks about marching on Congress to get their pay. Congress gets a little negative attention for being attached to the Newburgh Conspiracy. I will say, though, from what I've read, if he was involved, it's because he really thought a tax was needed to help the new nation that was about to win its independence in the next several months. I'm not going to excuse his possible actions since fomenting mutiny is bad, but I get what he was thinking. Washington did offer him the position of the Secretary of Treasury in 1789, but he turned it down, which is probably for the best because I don't think Morris sounds as good as Hamilton for music. Washington did offer him the position of Secretary of the Treasury in 1789, but he turned it down. That's probably for the best because I don't think Morris sounds as good as Hamilton for a musical. I can't. Washington did offer him the position of Secretary of the Treasury in 1789, but he turned it down. That's probably for the best because I don't think Morris sounds as good as Hamilton for a musical. I can't imagine the Morris raps. One last thing to bring up about Morris is that he ended his life bankrupt. He hit hard times with some bad land speculation and was never able to recover. Truthfully, I'm bringing it up because the man called the financier of the Civil War, Jay Cooke, also went through bankruptcy. Jay Cooke recovered some of his money. Robert Morris never did. But just the irony of two men, both called the financiers of a major American war, and both went into bankruptcy. That's just fascinating to me. How does that happen to both men? Crazy. Is it a conspiracy? Should someone look into this? So that's going to wrap this up. I love this topic because Robert Morris was a figure I knew very little about. He was never really heavily focused on in any of the history classes I took or most of the books I read, which made researching this even better. I learned new things about an extremely important figure. We could talk about battles and soldiers and all that, but if you don't pay your soldiers, they're not fighting. If you don't buy supplies, what are they fighting with? So the fact that he helped get all that for them is vital, and there's no downplaying his role. He was the superintendent of finance. He was on the secret committee, and the fact that he put his own credit at risk for Congress, that's massive. I didn't know he had done so much of this, which is why I love learning new things. I'm glad I got to talk to you about it. Hopefully you found this interesting too and want to explore more about Robert Morris. Well, that's it. So please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and tune in next week for another one. Thank you.